The CSS Obsidian, a long-haul deep space exploration vessel, drifted toward the distant exoplanet Ganymede 4. It was meant to be humanity's next frontier, a lush, untapped world. The mission had been simple: land, colonize, and expand. Instead, it became a nightmare without end. Captain Elias Doran gripped the armrests of his command chair, eyes locked onto the main viewport. The planet loomed ahead, a swirling mass of green and blue, promising life, a cruel irony. Somewhere down there, the first settlers had sent a final, frantic distress signal before all contact was lost. The distress signal had been garbled, distorted beyond recognition, but a single word had been clear: plague. Commander Riley Voss, his second-in-command, stood stiff beside him, her dark brows furrowed. "We shouldn't be doing this, Elias," she muttered under her breath. "Quarantine procedures exist for a reason. If an entire colony went dark, we should." "We have our orders," Doran cut in, though he didn't disagree. "We verify, contain, and report." Aboard the ship, over 200 crew members prepared for descent, most unaware of the true risk. Among them was Dr. Callum Hayes, a xenobiologist, the only one who had studied the anomaly in the received data. "It's unlike anything in our records," he had warned. "The signal doesn't indicate a virus, it's more." No one had taken him seriously. The ship entered the planet's orbit, and the first landing teams deployed. Voss coordinated from the bridge while Captain Doran monitored from above. The initial reports came in normal, oxygen level stable, no visible threats. And then, the screams. Static flooded the comms. Biosignatures blinked out in rapid succession. 30 men and women, wiped out in seconds. "Get them back up here." Voss barked, her fingers dancing across the control panels. But what came back wasn't human. The first shuttle docked in emergency quarantine. The airlock cycled open. Doran, Voss, and Dr. Hayes stood in the observation bay, looking into the sealed chamber. The landing crew stood motionless. Their suits were intact, their visors obscuring their faces. But something was wrong. They didn't move like people. Their breathing was silent. And then, slowly, they tilted their heads in perfect unison toward the observation window. A chilling hiss echoed from their comms. "Sweet Mother of God," Voss breathed. Dr. Hayes took a step back, horror dawning on his face. "That's not them anymore." The lights flickered. A deep, guttural groan vibrated through the ship's hull. And then the power died. The ship shuddered as if something ancient had awoken. Doran's blood ran cold. They had assumed the plague had wiped out the colony. They had been wrong. It had been waiting. And now, it had them. Alarms screamed across the CSS Obsidian, red emergency lights flickering in the dim corridors. The ship was silent except for the distant groan of shifting metal and the echoing blare of the quarantine sirens. Captain Elias Doran gritted his teeth as he stared through the reinforced glass at the landing crew in the containment chamber. They weren't human anymore. At least, not entirely. "Shut it down," he ordered, voice cold. "Seal that bay. I don't want a single microbe from that planet on my ship." Commander Riley Voss nodded sharply, fingers racing over the control console. The quarantine protocols engaged, but something felt wrong. The landing crew remained motionless in the isolation chamber, their visors still concealing their faces. Dr. Callum Hayes, standing between them, swallowed hard. "We can't let them in," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "The moment that door opens, it's over." Then the lights failed completely. The ship was swallowed by darkness. For a few terrible seconds, only the sound of the life support systems humming in the walls remained. And then, a deep, distorted whisper crackled through the ship's intercom. "WEAREHERE." The word slithered like an alien parasite into Doran's ears, the voice wrong, layered, inhuman. Voss cursed, flipping switches furiously. What the hell was that? Who's on comms? The emergency lighting flickered back to life in sickly hues of red. Doran turned his gaze back to the quarantine chamber. The landing crew was gone. His stomach lurched. Where are they? The chamber was sealed, no way out, no ventilation large enough for a person to crawl through. But where once there had been 6 figures in armored suits, now there was only empty space. Dr. Hayes staggered back, his breath coming fast. This isn't possible. This isn't a disease. It's not a virus. It's something else. Voss slammed the control panel. I don't care if it's the devil himself, we need to. A scream erupted from the corridor. A wet, choking scream. Doran's blood ran cold. Weapons, he barked, drawing his own sidearm. Now. The 3 of them bolted out of the control room, the sound of distant gunfire and frantic shouting spreading like wildfire across the ship. They barely made it into the main hallway before they saw it. A crew member stumbled forward, twitching, their body contorted at unnatural angles. Their uniform was soaked in black fluid, their jaw unhinged, hanging loosely, as if something inside had hollowed them out. Help me, the crewman gurgled. Then his spine cracked backward, and he lunged. Voss fired first. 3 shots to the chest. The thing didn't stop. Doran took aim and shot it in the head. The thing shuddered, its limbs spasming violently. The black fluid sizzled as if reacting to the bullet. Then, slowly, it collapsed, twitching in its own spreading pool of liquid. Silence. The 3 of them stood frozen, breaths ragged. What the hell was that? Voss whispered. Dr. Hayes knelt beside the body, his hand trembling as he reached toward the black liquid. It pulsed as if alive. And then, it moved toward him. He yelped and jerked away just in time. The black sludge slithered over the dead crewman's uniform, vanishing into the seams. Doran grabbed Hayes by the collar. Is it airborne? I don't know, Hayes stammered. But it's not behaving like a virus. It's thinking. Voss swore under her breath. We need to contain this, now. The ship's intercom crackled again. A new voice. Warped. Echoing. You bring us beyond the stars. Doran froze. His blood turned to ice. Because the voice wasn't alien. It wasn't unfamiliar. It was the voice of the ship's first officer, Lieutenant Marcus Shaw. Who had been on the landing crew. And who was supposed to be dead. The whispers grew, spreading across the ship like radio static, a chorus of broken, distorted voices, speaking in unison. And now, we are awake. The lights flickered. The walls groaned. And across the ship, doors began unlocking by themselves. Doran gritted his teeth and raised his weapon. They were no longer alone. The CSS Obsidian had become a graveyard. Captain Elias Doran, Commander Riley Voss, and Dr. Callum Hayes moved cautiously through the corridors, weapons drawn, their footsteps eerily muffled by the thick silence. The emergency lighting flickered, bathing the ship in rhythmic pulses of red, like a dying heartbeat. Every door that had been sealed before was now open. The intercom crackled again. You brought us here. The voices were layered, human but wrong, distorted as though something ancient spoke through them. Doran clenched his jaw. We need to get to the bridge. We seal off every section of the ship still under our control, regroup with the surviving crew, and figure out what the hell we're dealing with. Voss nodded, grip tightening on her sidearm. And if we're already compromised? Doran met her gaze. Then we make damn sure this infection doesn't leave this ship. They moved quickly, weapons at the ready, past open airlocks and flickering monitors displaying warped, unreadable data. Then, a scream. It came from a side corridor. Human. Alive. Doran hesitated for half a second before cursing and motioning toward the sound. Move. They rushed forward, rounding a corner to find two surviving crew members, Ensign Jace O'Hara and Lieutenant Naomi Kessler, backed into a supply bay. O'Hara had his weapon drawn, shaking like a leaf, while Kessler was trying to barricade the door. "Help us!" Kessler gasped, her eyes wide with sheer terror. Doran reached them in seconds. "What happened?" O'Hara just pointed, toward the corridor behind them. At first, it looked empty. And then the shadows moved. Something crawled from the ceiling, dropping silently onto the floor. Its body was human-shaped but wrong, its flesh glossy and black, its limbs elongated as if stretched from within. Its mouth, or what had once been a mouth, split open into writhing tendrils. Doran aimed his pistol. "Get inside. Now!" Kessler and O'Hara barely made it through the doorway before the thing lunged. Doran and Voss opened fire, the bullets slamming into its body, but instead of blood, black ichor splattered onto the floor, hissing like acid. The creature shuddered, then took another step forward. "Close the damn door!" Voss shouted. Hayes slammed the control panel, and the blast door sealed shut just as the thing rammed into it, shaking the entire room. Silence. Everyone was breathing heavily, hands still on their weapons. O'Hara sank to the floor, hands trembling. They just came out of nowhere. One of the engineers, Smith, he was fine 1 second, then his eyes went black and he just changed. Like something was already inside him. Doran felt the cold weight of those words sink into his gut. This wasn't just an infection. It was something worse. Kessler pressed her back against the wall, eyes darting around. "We have to get off this ship. If that plague reaches civilization." She didn't need to finish. They all knew. Doran ran a hand down his face, thinking fast. "Escape pods?" Voss shook her head. "Disabled. Same with the long-range comms. The ship's systems were compromised the moment we brought the landing crew on board." Kessler let out a ragged breath. "Then we're trapped." Hayes spoke up, his voice low and tight. "No. There's one chance." All eyes turned to him. "The auxiliary control room," Hayes said, adjusting his glasses. "It has an isolated systems hub, it's not part of the ship's main network. If we can reach it, I might be able to restore control to the comms or even restart the auto-defense protocols to purge the infected areas." Doran exhaled. "How far?" "2 decks down." "Through," Hayes swallowed. "Through engineering." The room went dead silent. Engineering. Where half the crew had been stationed when the infection spread. Where they had heard the first screams. O'Hara's face paled. "We're dead." Doran squared his shoulders, gripping his weapon tighter. "Not yet." He turned to Voss. "We take the maintenance corridors, keep quiet, move fast. We don't stop for anything." Voss hesitated, then nodded. "I'll take point." Kessler took a deep breath, steadying herself. O'Hara looked less certain but pushed himself to his feet. Doran locked eyes with Hayes. "If we do this, can you actually regain control?" Hayes hesitated. "If the system isn't compromised, yes." That wasn't reassuring. But it was all they had. Doran turned back to the others. "Then let's move." Elsewhere on the ship. In the silent corridors of the lower decks, something stirred. Black ichor pulsed along the walls, slithering through the ship's veins like a living entity. And then, a shape emerged. Once, it had been Lieutenant Marcus Shaw. Now, his body was twisted beyond recognition, his skin rippling with unnatural movement beneath. His mouth, too wide, filled with rows of glistening teeth, curled into something that almost resembled a smile. He lifted his head, eyes glowing with inky darkness, and turned toward the sound of footsteps above. The crew was moving. They thought they could escape. But there was nowhere left to run. The CSS Obsidian had become a haunted tomb, filled with voices that no longer belonged to the living. Captain Elias Doran led the group through the dim, red-lit maintenance corridors, each step careful, deliberate. Commander Riley Voss, Dr. Callum Hayes, Ensign Jace O'Hara, and Lieutenant Naomi Kessler followed close behind, weapons raised, nerves stretched to their breaking points. They had one goal: reach the auxiliary control room on the lower decks and take back control of the ship. But first, they had to pass through engineering. And that was where the horror had begun. The descent into hell. The corridor walls dripped with the black ichor, pulsing like veins beneath the ship's metal frame. It wasn't just a contagion. It was alive. Doran kept his voice low. We move fast. No unnecessary noise. If you see movement, you don't engage unless you have to. Voss gave a curt nod, leading the way with her rifle up. O'Hara's hands were shaking, but Kessler kept him steady with a reassuring glance. Hayes, lagging slightly behind, had his eyes fixed on the way the shadows moved, like something was watching them from within. Then the ship groaned. Not from stress, not from failing machinery, but from something else. As if the obsidian itself was breathing. Voss reached the entrance to engineering and stopped dead. Oh, shit. The doorway had changed. The metal frame was warped, stretched, its surface coated in black, pulsating flesh. The once pristine access panel was now a twisting mass of tendrils, shifting and slithering as if sensing their presence. Kessler recoiled. That's not possible. O'Hara swallowed. Tell me we're not going through there. We don't have a choice, Doran muttered. Hayes, any other routes? The scientist shook his head grimly. Everything else leads through primary corridors. Too exposed. This is still our best bet. Voss studied the doorway carefully. It looks organic. If it's growing, that means it's drawing power from somewhere. She turned to Hayes. Can you disrupt it? Hayes nodded hesitantly. I can overload the circuit behind it. If it's feeding off the power grid, a strong enough surge might force it to retract, at least for a few seconds. Doran motioned for him to move. Do it. Hayes crouched by the wall, prying open an access panel. His hands worked quickly, sweat beading on his forehead as he rewired the circuit. The ship shuddered again. From deep within engineering, something screeched. A cold chill ran through the group. Work faster, Doc, Voss hissed. Hayes gritted his teeth and yanked a final connection. Sparks erupted, and suddenly, the black mass convulsed violently, recoiling as if in pain. Go! Doran barked. They rushed through as the tendrils writhed, barely slipping past before the door sealed itself again behind them. Engineering, the hive. What had once been the heart of the ship was now unrecognizable. The control panels, reactor cores, and machinery were infested, covered in dark, organic matter. The ceiling dripped with vein-like tendrils, the walls pulsed with slow, rhythmic movement. And in the center of it all, bodies. Dozens of crew members, merged into the walls, fused into the living biomass. Their faces were stretched, frozen in silent screams, their flesh twisting into the grotesque architecture of the hive. O'Hara vomited. Kessler clamped a hand over her mouth, eyes wide with horror. My God! Voss swore under her breath. They're still alive. Hayes's face was pale, his voice barely above a whisper. No. Not alive. Something else. A wet, gurgling sound echoed from deeper within the room. Doran turned slowly, weapon raised. From the shadows, a figure stepped forward. It had once been Lieutenant Marcus Shaw. Now, he was something else. His body was elongated, his limbs stretched unnaturally, black veins coursing beneath his translucent skin. His face was almost human, but his eyes, inky voids, reflected something ancient. He smiled. Too wide. Too sharp. "You do not understand," he whispered. The sound of his voice made their stomachs churn. It was layered, as if thousands of voices spoke in unison. Voss raised her rifle. "Back the hell off, Shaw." Shaw didn't move. Instead, he tilted his head. Then he spoke again. "You were never meant to leave." The moment he said it, the walls screamed. The merged crew members twitched violently, their bodies shuddering as if trying to break free from the biomass. Then, they did. Hands burst from the walls, limbs snapping back into motion, bodies peeling themselves from the organic mass, their eyes black and hungry. They were becoming something else. Doran fired first, the shot echoing through the chamber as it slammed into Shaw's forehead. Shaw staggered but didn't fall. Instead, he laughed. The bullet wound sealed instantly, black ichor knitting the flesh back together. "We are the womb of the universe," he whispered, stepping forward. "And you?" The merged crew lunged. Doran didn't wait for the rest. "Run!" The team bolted, cutting through the maze of twisting, infected machinery as the abominations crawled after them, moving unnaturally fast, their bodies bending in impossible angles. Voss took point, firing into the swarm, but bullets only slowed them down, nothing killed them. Kessler screamed as one lunged from the ceiling, its fingers razor-sharp claws. O'Hara tackled it mid-air, slamming his knife into its throat, black sludge erupted, burning through his uniform, and he howled in pain. Doran grabbed him, dragging him along. "Move, damn it!" The exit was just ahead. Hayes punched a command panel on the way out, sealing the door behind them. The last thing they saw was Shaw, standing motionless in the hive, his smile widening, his black eyes watching them go. Then the doors locked shut. Aftermath. They stumbled into the next corridor, panting, bleeding, shaken to their core. O'Hara groaned, gripping his burned arm. We can't fight that." Doran clenched his jaw, heart pounding. "We won't." He turned to Hayes. "That thing, Shaw, it spoke like it had a purpose. What did it mean?" Hayes exhaled sharply. "I don't know. But I think we just found out." He glanced back toward the sealed door. "This plague isn't just spreading. It's creating." Voss wiped blood from her face. "We keep moving. Get to the auxiliary control room." Doran nodded. But deep down, he knew. They weren't just infected. They were becoming something else entirely. The corridors of the CSS Obsidian felt smaller with every passing moment. The air grew thick with tension, as though the ship itself was breathing in unison with the horror it now housed. Every corner was a potential death trap. Every shadow was a reminder that they weren't alone. Captain Elias Doran, Commander Riley Voss, Dr. Callum Hayes, Ensign Jace O'Hara, and Lieutenant Naomi Kessler moved cautiously through the winding hallways, trying to make their way to the auxiliary control room. The infected crew were everywhere, their grotesque bodies contorted into twisted, living amalgamations of human and something else, something darker, ancient, and alien. The emergency lights flickered, casting eerie red hues over their faces, and the ship seemed to groan under its own weight. The walls pulsed like a beating heart, and the faint whispers from the intercom returned, growing louder, more insistent. "The womb of the universe grows. We are legion. We are eternal." Dr. Hayes looked pale, his gaze darting nervously between the others. "This ship. It's a breeding ground. Whatever this thing is, it doesn't just infect. It reconstructs. It makes itself part of everything it touches. Doran's jaw clenched. It's creating a hive, using the crew to build itself. And if we don't stop it, it spreads, Voss finished, her voice tight. They passed by another doorway, once locked, now hanging half open, the walls behind it shifting in grotesque movements. The team quickened their pace, each of them bracing for the worst. There was no turning back now. They had to reach the auxiliary control room. The inner sanctum. The group reached the lower decks, where the auxiliary control room was located. The door to the room was heavily secured, but it was the only remaining safe haven on the ship. Hayes had already worked out the bypass, and now it was a matter of getting inside. 5 seconds, Hayes said, working at the control panel. He was sweating, clearly exhausted, but his mind was sharp. After I override this, we'll have a window to act. It won't last long, just long enough to either disable the ship's core or get a signal out. Voss was already watching the hallway, her rifle trained on the dark, empty space. We're not alone. I can hear them. Doran nodded, his hand resting on his weapon. No matter what happens, we stick together. Suddenly, the door buzzed open, the metal sliding smoothly to the side, revealing the small, dimly lit room. Inside, the control panels flickered, but it was clear the room had been compromised. The walls had begun to show signs of organic growth, tendrils creeping out from the seams. The whole room had been overtaken. Doran stepped in first, motioning for the others to follow. Get to the console, Hayes. We don't have much time. The room seemed to shrink the longer they stayed in it. The hum of machinery was now mingled with an unnerving squealing noise, and the air grew choked with something foul. Every moment felt like it was pushing them closer to the edge. O'Hara's voice broke through the tension. Captain, we've got company. Doran turned quickly, just in time to see a mass of dark shapes emerging from the hallway. They were moving slowly, but with purpose. The infected. A dozen of them, at least, twisted, human-like creatures, their bodies a grotesque blend of flesh and alien biomass. They were heading straight for the control room. And they were fast. Voss fired first, her shots ripping into the front of the group, but it was as though the bullets barely fazed them. The black ichor pulsed with each impact, but the creatures just kept coming. Get inside, now. Doran shouted, pulling O'Hara in behind him. Kessler had just entered when the first of the infected reached the doorway. It was Shaw. He was different now, no longer just an infected human, but something far worse. He had expanded, his body undulating with alien growths that cracked as they pushed outward. His face was barely recognizable, but the dark eyes, those black voids, still stared at them. Shaw opened his mouth, but it wasn't his voice that came out. We are the future, it hissed in a chorus of thousands of voices. You are the first of many. Doran reacted on instinct, raising his rifle and firing directly at Shaw's chest. But Shaw didn't fall. Instead, the bullets bounced off, the mass of black ichor around his body absorbing the impact and healing instantly. Hayes, now! Doran barked. Hayes scrambled toward the console, fingers flying over the controls. Sweat poured down his face as the infected began to surround them, moving slowly, like a creeping death, getting closer and closer with every second. Almost there, Hayes muttered, his voice strained. Faster! Voss shouted, firing again, but her shots were now almost pointless. The infected had become too many. Shaw grinned, revealing rows of jagged teeth. You will become part of us. The lights flickered, and the room shuddered again. Hayes's fingers slipped over a button, and suddenly, a pulse of energy erupted, and the entire ship screamed. The power grid overloaded, sending shockwaves through the ship as the systems went into chaos. The room flickered with the violent surge of energy, the lights flickering in and out as the control panels short-circuited. And then, everything went black. The silence. When the lights flickered back on, the ship was eerily quiet. The hum of the engines had stopped. Doran opened his eyes. The control room was now frozen in time, the walls silent, the air thick with the aftereffects of the surge. But something felt wrong. Shaw was gone. The infected that had surrounded them were now motionless, their bodies twitching in unnatural ways, as though they had been paused. Doran cautiously stood, moving toward Hayes, who was still bent over the console, breathing heavily. "Did you do it?" Hayes nodded, but his face was pale, almost ghostly. I stopped them. For now." Doran glanced over at the frozen figures of the infected. "This won't hold forever." "No," Hayes agreed. "But it will give us time to figure out what the hell this thing is, and how to stop it." Doran exhaled, feeling a strange, hollow sense of relief. For the moment, they were alive. But the real battle was only just beginning. The plague had not only infected the ship, it had spread into the very heart of the universe. The CSS Obsidian was no longer a ship, it was a tomb. The last remnants of its once proud crew now lay frozen, suspended in grotesque limbo, part of an alien force that had become the living core of the vessel. And yet, despite the temporary halt of the plague's advance, Captain Elias Doran knew that their fight was far from over. The real enemy had never been entirely visible. It was the silent hunger that thrived inside the ship, the slow, creeping force that had already spread far beyond the hull. The control room was still locked down, the energy pulse having shut off all communication systems. For a moment, there was nothing but stillness. Yet, Doran couldn't shake the feeling that they were on borrowed time. Every breath he took seemed to carry the weight of the unknown with it. Commander Riley Voss stood by the door, eyes scanning the hall outside. She was silent, like a predator, always on edge. Dr. Callum Hayes was hunched over a secondary console, his hands trembling slightly as he worked to restore power to their primary systems. Jace O'Hara had taken a position by the back exit, his nervous eyes darting around as if expecting the infected to come pouring in at any moment. And Lieutenant Naomi Kessler was at the far end, standing guard, clutching her rifle with a white-knuckled grip. It was quiet. Too quiet. But then, a soft click echoed from the comms unit, followed by a series of static bursts. The radio crackled to life with a distorted voice. "Is anyone out there?" Voss's eyes widened, and she moved closer to the console. "Who the hell is that?" Doran's heart skipped. "This is Captain Elias Doran of the CSS Obsidian." "Who are you?" The voice on the other end was distorted, crackling with interference, but it was unmistakable. We're wrong. The plague, it isn't just a virus. It's a call. The dead are calling to each other, from beyond the universe. It's coming." Hayes stepped back, his face a mixture of confusion and dread. "The dead are calling? What does that even mean?" The voice continued, barely audible now through the static. "The Obsidian. You shouldn't have come back. It's already too late." Suddenly, the transmission cut out, leaving only an eerie silence. "God damn it." Voss cursed under her breath. "We need to find out who that was." But Doran didn't answer. Instead, his gaze turned to the monitor on the wall, where an unexpected reading flickered to life. The ship's sensors had just picked up a strange energy signature. "What the hell is that?" Doran muttered, narrowing his eyes. It wasn't just a single blip. There were multiple readings, all coming from deep within the ship's lower sections, from the reactor core. "Shit." Hayes's voice was strained. "The core's been compromised." "What does that mean?" Voss asked, taking a step forward. "The energy signature, it's not human. It's something alien. And it's spreading. The ship's core, it's a beacon. It's been reaching out to something out there. Hayes swallowed hard. We were right. This plague, it's not just a disease. It's a signal. Doran clenched his fists. A signal for what? For them. Hayes whispered, his voice heavy with dread. For whatever's on the other side of the galaxy. They're coming. Before anyone could respond, a sudden screech echoed down the hallway. It was a sound like no other, unnatural, otherworldly, as if the ship itself was being torn apart by invisible hands. The lights flickered. The ship seemed to shudder once more, and the walls groaned. We've got company, Captain. Voss raised her weapon, eyes scanning the shadows. Another screech came, this one closer. O'Hara's face went white. That's not a human sound. Doran took a step toward the door, his voice cold and steady. Stay sharp. We're not alone. The infections had begun to adapt. They were no longer just mindless zombies. They had evolved. The hive had formed, and now it was working to expand, to infect every part of the ship. But the plague had also reached beyond the walls of the obsidian, it had sent out a signal. A signal to something far more dangerous, far more ancient than they could ever imagine. And now that something was coming. The unseen enemy. As Doran opened the door, the hallway beyond was a twisted nightmare. Tendril-like vines now hung from the ceiling, and patches of blackened, fleshy mass had overtaken the walls. The entire corridor seemed alive, breathing, pulsing with energy. The group moved carefully, guns raised, but the air was heavy with a sense of impending doom. They weren't just fighting an infection anymore. They were facing a force, an ancient presence that had existed long before they ever set foot in the stars. It came from the deepest reaches of the universe, an intelligence that thrived on the dead and the lost. The first sign of their new enemy came when a shadow dropped down from the ceiling. It was quick, too fast, and it lunged at O'Hara. His weapon discharged, but it was already too late. The thing, too large to be human, clamped its jaws down on his shoulder. His scream echoed through the ship as its black, slick skin folded around him. O'Hara! Kessler screamed, rushing to his aid. But it was no use. The thing pulled him into the wall, dragging him into the infected mass that was beginning to grow all around them. The walls closed in, the living biomass swallowing O'Hara whole. No! Doran roared, but it was too late. We can't stop it. Not like this. Voss said, voice trembling. We need to destroy the core. Take it out, or it will never end. Hayes's face was pale, but he nodded. I'll help. But we need to get to the reactor now. Doran's eyes flicked toward the entrance to the lower decks, where the alien signal originated. There was no other choice. Let's move. But as they pushed forward, they knew that they weren't just fighting to survive, they were fighting to stop something greater than themselves from breaking through. The darkness was closing in, and it was far worse than anything they could have ever imagined. The enemy beyond the stars. The invisible force that had reached across the void, answering the signal from the obsidian, was close. It was not a plague. It was not a disease. It was an awakening. And it was coming for them. The CSS Obsidian was rapidly becoming a prison, and time was running out. The last moments of calm had dissolved, replaced by a deep, gnawing feeling of imminent doom. The infected had become more intelligent, and now there were things aboard the ship, creatures, moving with a purpose, as if they were being guided by an unseen hand. Doran's team was now walking a thin line between survival and annihilation, and the tension in the air was palpable. Captain Elias Doran, Commander Riley Voss, Dr. Callum Hayes, and Lieutenant Naomi Kessler were all that remained of the Obsidian's crew, though they were now more like wanderers in their own ship, struggling to stay alive as the walls of the vessel closed in on them. Every step forward was a gamble. Every breath felt like a countdown to something they couldn't quite understand. This is bad. Voss muttered, scanning the hallway once more. Her rifle was aimed at the shadows, her instincts on edge. Worse than bad. Doran said, his gaze fixed on the reactor core's faint glow in the distance. We're heading straight into the heart of it. Dr. Hayes had been working tirelessly to understand what was happening to the ship, but the more data they gathered, the more it became clear that nothing about this was natural. The virus, or whatever it was, had only been the first wave. The real force was the presence that had awakened with the plague, a force beyond human understanding. We're not just fighting a plague, Hayes said, his voice barely above a whisper as they navigated the dark corridor. We're fighting something that has been waiting for eons. It's like the ship, it's a conduit. A signal beacon. And that signal, it's reaching far out into the void. Whoever, or whatever, heard it is coming. Coming? Voss repeated. We're already feeling the effects. I thought the whole point was to stop it from spreading. We haven't stopped it, Hayes said, looking down at his console with a grim expression. We've just delayed it. Whatever is waiting out there, it's not just here for the ship. It's here for the entire universe. Doran exhaled sharply. We can't stop it, then. Not without destroying the core. If we can't get to it in time, then everything we've done will be for nothing. Kessler, who had been silent for most of the conversation, spoke up. We have to get to the core now. Before it becomes too late. And so they moved, deeper into the belly of the obsidian, passing flickering lights and twisted hallways, the eerie hum of the ship's recovered energy pulsing in the background. The walls were no longer just walls, they had become alive, shifting with something that could only be described as hunger. At each turn, the crew encountered more resistance. The infected, now twisted, had started to take on shapes that made them almost unrecognizable as human. Their movements were more coordinated, like beasts that had learned to hunt in packs. And the whispers, they were getting louder. It's coming. We are Legion. It never ends. Doran pressed forward, his jaw clenched tight. The walls seemed to pulse around them, and the air grew colder. Then, a sound, a screech, split the silence, followed by the unmistakable slap of something wet against the floor. Kessler raised her weapon, eyes darting. What the hell was that? Before anyone could respond, a figure stepped into view. It was Shaw, or at least, what had once been Shaw. His body was now barely human, his features blended with the alien growth, his eyes deep voids of blackness. You cannot stop it. Shaw's voice was a chorus of distorted tones. It is already within you. It is a part of all that is. Doran felt his gut twist. Shaw, fight it. Fight whatever's controlling you. But Shaw didn't respond. Instead, his body expanded, his limbs twisting as though they were made of something otherworldly, and then, with a grotesque screech, he lunged. Get back! Voss shouted as she fired. But Shaw didn't fall. Instead, his form splintered, and what emerged from his body was a mass of black tendrils, crawling, shifting, almost like a massive creature. It was no longer Shaw, it was something far worse. The creatures weren't just infected humans anymore. They were evolving, becoming something new, a unified force of alien will. Hayes fired his gun in a futile attempt to slow the creature, but the bullets ricocheted off its blackened skin like pebbles against steel. The thing surged forward, its movements erratic and wild, a mindless horror that only wanted to consume. We have to keep moving. Doran shouted, grabbing Hayes by the arm and pulling him away. The team sprinted toward the reactor core, knowing that this was their only chance. The infected might have been evolving, but their true enemy was whatever lay on the other side of the plague, a force that wasn't bound by time or space. As they reached the final hall before the reactor, the air grew thick with static, and the whispers intensified, becoming a cacophony of voices. The walls began to shift, the ship itself turning into a breathing, living organism, as if the plague had begun to merge with the very essence of the obsidian. "Get to the reactor!" Voss yelled. They were so close, too close. The core's power fluctuated, and the ship began to shake violently. There was no turning back now. If they didn't act, if they didn't destroy the core before it became fully consumed, then the entire universe would be at the mercy of the darkness that was awakening. And as Doran approached the reactor's control panel, he finally understood. They weren't just fighting a virus. They were fighting an ancient force, a presence that had been lying dormant, waiting for the right signal to bring it into the world. But as the core's lights began to pulse violently, Doran realized the true horror. The signal had been sent, and the darkness was already here. The obsidian's core flickered with violent, erratic energy, casting an eerie, pulsating light down the hallway. The ship seemed to groan, its structure slowly giving way to the darkness that had infiltrated its very essence. Doran's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped closer to the reactor's control panel, his hands steady despite the chaos around him. They had reached the final threshold, the heart of the ship, the source of all the alien energy that had been corrupted by the plague. There was no time for hesitation now. "We have to shut it down." Doran's voice was a grim whisper, but his tone was firm. "But what if we're too late?" Kessler's voice trembled with dread as she scanned the room for any movement, her rifle ready, though it seemed useless against what was coming. Doran glanced at the flickering control panel. The alien energy signature was off the charts, its intensity growing with each passing second. It was only a matter of time before the ship would be overwhelmed, consumed entirely by the force they had unknowingly unleashed. "We don't have a choice, Kessler." Doran's gaze hardened as he turned to face the others. "We can't let it reach the heart of the galaxy. If we destroy the core, we can still sever the connection. If we fail, then everything, the universe, it's all lost." Hayes, who had been analyzing the data for hours, suddenly stood straighter, his face pale. "It's not just the core anymore, Doran. The signal is growing. It's already spreading beyond the ship. It's calling to something." "We know," Voss said grimly. "We've been feeling it. The infections, the creatures, they're not just mindless anymore. They're moving with purpose, and it's not just for us. They're gathering, preparing for the next step. But what I don't understand is, how did this happen? How did we? We woke it up." Hayes interrupted, his voice hollow with realization. "The virus, the plague, it was only the beginning. The signal was always there, dormant in the fabric of the ship, waiting for a moment of weakness. And now, it's too strong to stop." Doran's jaw clenched. There was no turning back. The entire universe was at risk, and if they didn't act now, if they didn't destroy the core, the darkness would spread further. The signal would continue, and nothing would be able to stop it. A strange hum echoed through the ship. The walls seemed to pulse with life, and the air was thick with a suffocating energy that seemed to reach out, calling to them. "Get to the control panel." Doran's voice was sharp. "Shut it down. We need to sever the signal." As Hayes moved to the panel, his hands shaking as he inputted the shutdown codes, Voss and Kessler stood on guard, watching the shadows as they swarmed in on them. The infected were closing in, faster now, more aggressive, and there was no room for error. Suddenly, the door to the core room slammed shut behind them. A low, rumbling growl filled the air as the ship's walls began to tremble. Something was wrong. The core's lights flickered, then flared bright. The hum of energy grew louder, and the ship shuddered violently, throwing them all off balance. Hayes staggered, his fingers slipping from the control panel. "What the hell is happening?" Voss yelled, her gun aimed at the door. "It's like the ship itself is fighting back." "It is." Doran muttered, his eyes narrowing. The core was reacting, but not in the way they had expected. The energy surge was unlike anything they had ever encountered, alien, powerful, almost as if it were alive, a living being fighting for survival. And then, it hit them, the realization that chilled them to the bone. The plague was never meant to spread within the ship alone. It had been meant to infest the universe, to reach out into the stars. The infected were no longer just infected, they were agents, vessels, for something far older, far more powerful. The alien presence that had awoken was no mere virus. It was a consciousness, a force of nature, that had found its way into the obsidian, and now it was expanding, growing, seeping into the galaxy. The lights flickered again. This time, the control panel shorted out, and a terrible screech echoed from the depths of the ship. "No!" Hayes shouted, slamming his fist against the console. "It's too late. We can't stop it. The core it's merging with the plague. Then we have to destroy it." Doran's voice was cold, resolute. "We don't have much time." Without thinking, Doran grabbed the nearest plasma grenade from his belt and threw it at the control panel. The explosion rocked the room, and a bright light consumed everything. When Doran came to, everything was silent. The obsidian was no longer trembling. The walls no longer pulsed with energy. There was no more screeching, no more sound of the infected. The ship was still. But the silence was deafening. "Did we do it?" Kessler asked quietly, her voice shaky. Doran slowly stood, looking around. The core had been destroyed, the alien presence, severed from the ship, had been wiped out. But there was no victory in his heart. The battle had been won, yes, but the war was far from over. The signal had been severed, but the universe had heard it. The beacon had gone off, and the force that had been waiting in the dark was already coming. He took one last look at his team, and then turned toward the exit. There was no time to waste. "Let's go," Doran said, his voice grim. "We're not done yet." The crew of the CSS Obsidian had survived the plague. But the darkness beyond the stars? That was just the beginning. The universe was about to feel the true horror of what had been awakened.